Lesson 47 UseRef. 1. Introduction. Good morning, afternoon. Today I'd like to introduce the concept of UseRef in React and explain how it fits into the broader story of hooks and component design. The purpose is to understand when and why you would use this hook, how it behaves differently from state, and what pitfalls to watch for. 2. What is UseRef? UseRef is a hook in React. Its core purpose is to create a reference object whose value can persist for the lifetime of the component, but which does not trigger re-renders when changed. In other words, you get a container whose content you can read or update, and React will reliably return the same object on each render. It's important to emphasize, UseRef is intended for values that do not directly influence what gets displayed to the user. If a value does influence what you see, you're better off using state. 3. Key behavior and returned value. When you call UseRef, you get back an object with a property, commonly called current. The initial value you pass becomes the starting value of that property. On subsequent renders, you keep getting back the same object. That means you can store something today, and pick it up later, in a later render, and the container remains stable. Because the value is not tied to the component's render cycle in the usual sense, changing it does not mean React will re-render the component. That is a central distinction from using state. 4. Primary use cases. There are several common scenarios where UseRef shines. Storing a value that needs to survive between renders but does not drive UI updates. For example, an identifier for a timer, or a reference to some external resource. Referencing a DOM node, or similar imperatively managed resource, so that you can manually interact with it, for example, moving focus, or measuring it. Keeping a stable instance of something, object or other value, whose recreation on each render would be wasteful or undesirable. 5. Comparing to state. Because UseRef does not trigger renders when modified, it should not be used in place of state when the UI depends on the value. If you have something that, when changed, needs to show a new value on screen, then state is the correct tool. On the other hand, if you have something purely internal, or purely imperative, then UseRef is more suitable. Another difference. Whereas state is replaced or updated in a controlled way and causes re-render, a ref is mutable and you can change its current property directly. But because React doesn't see this change in terms of render logic, you must use it carefully. 6. Avoiding common mistakes. There are some traps to avoid when using UseRef. Do not read or write the current property during the render phase, i.e., inside the component's body in a way that depends on render. Doing so can break the purity assumptions of React components. Do not use ref as a replacement for state when the value is meant to be shown or used in rendering. Because changing it won't trigger render, the displayed UI might become stale or inconsistent. When initializing a ref with a complex or expensive value, if you do so directly inside the render, you may inadvertently repeat work every render even though the ref value is only used once. In those cases you might apply a guard to only create the instance on first time. 7. Troubleshooting, special considerations. One notable situation, if you try to assign a ref to a custom component, rather than a built-in DOM node, and try to access some internal part of that component, you may find that it doesn't work as expected, because by default custom components don't forward refs or expose their internal DOM nodes. In those cases you either need to explicitly forward the ref or expose the needed API via props. Also note, in React strict mode during development, the component function may be called more than once for detecting impurities. This means you might see the ref object created twice, but one instance will be discarded. This is a development-only effect and does not affect production behavior. 8. Summary. UseRef is a hook for situations where you need a stable container to hold a value across renders, when that value does not itself trigger rendering changes. It is ideal for referencing DOM nodes, timers, or other persistent objects where mutation is acceptable and performance matters. But it must not be confused with state. If the UI changes because of the value, then you should use state instead. Use it thoughtfully, avoid misusing it during rendering, and you'll find it a powerful addition to your React toolset. 9. Closing and next steps. In our next session, we'll look at concrete examples of UseRef in action, compare patterns and anti-patterns, and then explore advanced use cases like creating stable instances or integrating with external imperative libraries. For now, reflect on where in your own work you might have values that persist between renders, but don't need to drive UI updates. Those are prime candidates for UseRef.